This is a story about how an award-winning journalist from Germany used my home community in rural Minnesota as an anthropological ground zero about Trump country and fabricated nearly every sentence. How my friend and I, two everyday small-town rural citizens, wrote a feverish response that went internationally viral within minutes. And how I believe that we don't need to choose between what makes us happy and whole and what can change the world. I was 6 months pregnant with my first son, and the holidays were coming. Getting ready to be a new mom had me reflecting a lot about my personal values and whether I was truly living them out. I had recently vowed to make more space in my life for those values, specifically creative writing. I realized that despite my efforts to create generative feminist processes of rural community development, I had depleted myself by conforming to patriarchal notions of leadership. I was trying to be in charge of everything. I was pushing my ideas onto other people, and I was choosing work before health, well-being, and my creative practice. So in December, I resigned from several community boards and committees, and I gave myself permission to rest and step back. I remember saying to myself many times, your writing can be your activism, but I wasn't quite sure what that looked like yet. One morning, I was having coffee with a friend when my phone buzzed. I glanced and saw there was a tweet from our city administrator. Not a normal thing to have him contact me that way, but I ignored it until I was walking to my office. Then I opened up my phone and saw a headline in German that translated to, "A Der Spiegel reporter has manipulated his own stories to a large extent." I knew in that moment that my life was about to change. My slow, pregnant walk in the snow turned into a jog and then a sprint to my office. I burst through the front door and ran straight to my desk, frantically plugging in my computer. The headlines blurred in front of me. I scanned frantically through a rough translation of an article which explained that Klaus Rolodius, an award-winning reporter from the high-profile German magazine Der Spiegel, had resigned after being caught by his colleague for fabricating not one, but dozens of his articles. My friend Jake and I were texting frantically. You see, Rolodius had visited our town for 5 weeks, almost a year ago, and then he had published a lengthy article about us that was titled, "Where They Pray for Trump on Sundays." His article wasn't just biased, it was complete fiction. It's true, we live in a conservative area, so there's plenty of real stories he could have covered to tell the story he came to find. But for some reason, he had gone through the trouble of making everything up. He painted the picture of a bleak, isolated town that has no access to national news and is obsessed with the movie American Sniper. He described a welcome sign with stars and stripes that does not exist. And he crafted complete lies about people in our town, including the owner of our Mexican restaurant, who he said was dying of kidney disease. She's not. And voted for Trump. She didn't. And our city administrator, Andrew, who carries a gun. He doesn't, and has a stuffed wild boar in his office. Nope. Over the last few months, Jake and I had been crafting a response in a shared Google Doc, fact-checking every strange little anecdote by talking to the individuals he had profiled. We were in a holding pattern with a near-final draft, trying to figure out how and when to share it. We had no idea, writing this rebuttal, that we were about to get involved with an international media scandal. Back at my office that December when the news broke, the baby in my belly was doing backflips as I scanned our draft, getting the essay ready to post. I remember hesitating on the closing few paragraphs, which were in my voice. How do you defend your community against fake news without resorting to blind Pollyanna boosterism? I started to delete some of the sentences where I shared the raw sadness and frustration I had felt since the 2016 election, not understanding how the region I lived in could vote so strongly for a racist, sexist leader. But my friend Jake stopped me. Michele, you're a young female community leader, and you're about to raise a child here. You are completely entitled to say what you think. He's a good friend. So I hit post and tweeted the article out. The rest of the day is surreal. Part of me sort of hoped our little article would just dissolve into the social media void. But the opposite happened. the post went from 1,000 views to 15,000 to 30,000 in a matter of hours. The Minneapolis Star-Tribune called, the New York Times called, and then starting around 3:30 a.m. the next morning when Europe was waking up, there was requests every 5 minutes. The BBC, German Public Radio, NPR, the CBC, Huffington Post, Fox News, and dozens more. Jake and I met up at my office at sunrise and took interviews until dinner time. The next day, a new reporter from Der Spiegel arrived in town to clean up the mess and apologize. The media inquiries went on for another week, right up until Christmas Eve day. I did one last phone interview sitting in the car with a back seat full of presents at the liquor store while my husband bought wine for our family dinner. Things were very quiet until a month or so later when an editor from the New York Times invited me to write an op-ed. She asked, "So, now that this is over, what do you actually want to tell the community about rural life?" For the next 2 months, I found myself writing a much slower piece, a rather personal account of what it's been like to be a homecomer in Fergus Falls for the last 8 years, and why it feels urgent and powerful to commit to this place at this time. Writing it helped me begin to sort out the feelings I had had since the Der Spiegel incident. How many of us, particularly rural women, are walking a confusing tightrope between fighting the narratives that scapegoat our rural neighbors, and when, at the same time, we can easily be discarded and silenced by those same neighbors for questioning and articulating the systems of privilege and power that are dragging our communities down. When I sent in my final draft, I still didn't quite believe it would be published. At my 37-week prenatal checkup, my doctor asked me if I would be writing anymore. I mentioned to him that I had just written an essay for the New York Times and that I was nervous about it being published. "Well," he said, "writing is a type of activism, isn't it?" And he said this as we listened to my baby's heartbeat. The article was published in the Sunday Review that weekend, and then, only 1 week later, my son, Ashton, arrived. In between the article being published and going into labor, I tried my best to sift through the hundreds of messages I received in response. In some ways, I think my son came early to protect me in that moment and to help me step into my power. Because several people hated my article, but for opposing reasons. I was too liberal and had somehow thrown my community under the bus by writing about our challenges. And I wasn't progressive enough because, being a straight white woman, I was able to move back home and fit right in. One man from New York even mailed me a letter angrily asking why I didn't own up to what rural voters did to our country. But for every criticism, I got a dozen heartfelt messages from other homecomers who shared their stories with me, and those messages reminded me not to apologize for taking the opportunity to use my voice and connect. As I received mixed responses from the community, I also thought about how too often people in my town with incredibly strong convictions are hesitant to speak up about urgent issues. They're afraid of losing friends, donors, or business. And this is understandable. Living and working in rural is a long game. But my hope is that we can think bigger and remember that speaking up is a way to find each other across the abyss. And finally, in the midst of these bigger issues, there's something else that's been on my mind. When I think back on the decision to step back from traditional roles in leadership and write more, I think about how the world responded and told me something. Yes, do that. As William Stafford says in my favorite poem, "The darkness around us is deep." These days it can feel like everything and nothing we do matters. All that I know from this experience is that we need all types of leaders right now. But most of all, we need leaders that are charged up by what makes us whole and happy. Not all of us need to run for office to change the world. Some of us can quietly restore a native prairie, or cook food for friends, or write as our activism. Because what makes us happy and awake and alive just might be the loudest thing we can do to get the world to pause and listen and change.